The last time I called my mother spontaneously, not because it was her birthday, not because something was wrong, was 14 months into the relationship. I didn't notice the gap until much later when I was sitting alone in an apartment that felt like his apartment even though my name was on the lease, scrolling through my phone looking for someone to call, and I got to her name and realized I couldn't remember the last time I dialed it without a reason. I went further back in my contacts. Most of the people I used to call regularly, Jess, my coworker Priya, my college roommate Dana, had drifted to the bottom of the list, not because anything happened, because nothing had happened, because nothing had happened between us in a very long time. He didn't ask me to stop calling anyone. That's the first thing I want to be clear about. There was never a conversation where he said, "Don't see your friends," or "I don't want you talking to your mother." What there was, instead, was a very steady and patient practice of making every relationship in my life feel like something I needed to explain. The first time was with Jess. We'd been close since the early days of my job, lunch every week, texts throughout the day. He met her once, at a bar, and afterward he was quiet on the drive home. I asked what was wrong. He said nothing. He just wasn't sure she was a good influence. I asked what that meant. He said she'd been a little flirty, and he understood it wasn't my fault. But did I notice how she spoke to me sometimes? Like she didn't entirely respect me? I said I hadn't noticed. He said he was probably wrong. He just cared about me. He dropped it. But the next week, when I mentioned lunch with Jess, he mentioned he'd been hoping we could spend the afternoon together, just the two of us. He'd had a hard week. He made it about connection, not control. He made it about us, not about her. I canceled lunch. It was the first of many. The logic was always the same. It was never about the other person doing something wrong. It was about their effect on me. Priya at work was too competitive, and he was worried I was absorbing her stress. My college roommate Dana was still single and still grieving her last relationship. And being around that kind of energy was holding me back. My mother. This one took longer. Didn't understand the kind of relationship we had. She was too protective. She saw problems where there weren't any. He said this gently. Always gently. Always positioned as concern rather than accusation. He wasn't telling me to stop seeing them. He was noting with great care the emotional cost of each relationship to my well-being. What I was doing, without labeling it, was performing a calculation. Every time I wanted to see one of these people, I now factored in the debrief afterward, the questions, the quietness, the way he would listen carefully and then say something that sounded like insight but left me feeling like I'd done something subtly wrong. The calculation made it easier to cancel than to go. There's a moment in the middle of an isolation process where you believe you are making choices. You are. That is the most accurate thing I can say about this period. I was choosing, freely and without coercion, to spend less time with the people who loved me. What I was not accounting for was that the menu of choices I was working from had been quietly edited. By the time I was 14 months in, the relationships I had that required no debrief, no explanation, no emotional management afterward, were the relationships I'd allowed to go quiet. The relationships that felt uncomplicated were the ones inside his orbit. His friends, his coworkers, the social life we built together that was functionally entirely his. I had access to all of it. I was included. I felt included. The feeling of being known and held inside that group was real. What I did not notice was that I was the only one in the group who had arrived from somewhere else and stayed. My mother started leaving messages. At first I called back the same day, then within the week. Then I started composing a reason I hadn't called. Something I could report when I eventually did, something that would explain the silence without inviting further questions. He noticed this habit before I did. He said gently that it seemed like I was stressed about the calls with her. Was she putting pressure on me? I said no. He said, "Well, that's interesting, because it seems like they tire you out." He wasn't wrong. They were tiring. in the same way that anything you're managing while watching yourself from a slight distance is tiring. But that's not the same thing as the relationship being the problem. The anchor I come back to now is the contact list. That phone. The way I had been scrolling it in the months before the end, looking for someone to call, and getting 3 names deep before the list became archaeology. Before the names became people I would need to explain the gap to. A gap I didn't have a clean explanation for. I told myself I'd been busy, focused, that healthy relationships don't require constant maintenance. I had absorbed, without registering it as a belief, the idea that the people who had known me longest were somehow the least essential to my daily life. The ending was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no revelation. He said something about my career that was so precisely wrong, not cruel, not loud, just wrong in a way that could only be true if he'd stopped understanding anything about me. And I sat with that wrongness for a long time. Then I called my mother. Not because something was wrong, exactly. I just called. She picked up on the second ring and said she'd been thinking about me, and I started crying on the first word she said back. I rebuilt the contact list over about 2 years. Not all of it came back. Some people had moved into their own lives in ways that didn't have a natural slot for me anymore. Jess got married and moved. Dana relocated. Some of the silence I was responsible for. And the responsibility isn't something I get to put down just because I understand now what was happening inside it. What I know now is that isolation doesn't announce itself. There is no speech. There is no ultimatum. There is instead a very slow and very methodical introduction of a cost to every relationship that doesn't include him. A cost measured in emotional labor, in explanation, in the particular fatigue of knowing that any time you invest in someone outside the circle will require you to account for it afterward. The cost rises slowly. The accounting becomes automatic. And eventually you stop making the call, not because you were told not to, but because it simply seems from inside the experience like the harder option. He protected me from everyone who could have told me what was happening. Was the protection the point? Or was the isolation?